She fed a silent boy every morning. No name, no questions, just kindness. But when a helicopter landed outside the gas station, everything changed. Who was the boy? And what secret was he hiding? Fern Blake woke at 5, as she always did, to the low hum of silence that filled the small house on the outskirts of Butte, Montana. The bedroom was dimly lit by the pale gray light slipping through the curtains. Outside the window, the rolling hills were still veiled in mist, their silhouettes fading into the early morning fog. The house, once lively with conversation and footsteps, now echoed only with the creaks of settling wood and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Since her husband passed away 3 years prior, Fern had lived alone. The photographs on the walls, smiling faces in summer sunlight, a younger version of herself with wind-tousled hair, her late husband holding a fishing rod, had begun to feel like artifacts rather than memories. Her daughter, now living in Denver, rarely called. The occasional birthday message or postcard was all that remained of their once daily conversations. The silence no longer hurt. It had settled into her like a familiar coat, heavy but manageable. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long moment, letting the cold air wrap around her. Then, with a practiced rhythm, she moved through the morning, heating water in the kettle, spooning weak instant coffee into a chipped mug, and staring out the kitchen window as steam curled upward. Her uniform hung neatly on the back of the chair, forest green with a faded name patch that read F. Blake. She put it on with mechanical care, smoothing the creases with her palms. By 5:40, she stepped outside. The gravel crunched under her boots as she made her way to the old blue pickup parked beside the house. The truck groaned in protest as it started, a sound she no longer flinched at. The road to the gas station was quiet at this hour. Occasionally a deer would dart across the path, or headlights would pierce the fog in the distance. She drove without the radio on, letting the sound of the tires on the road and the distant cries of birds fill the space. The gas station sat near a bend in the highway that led toward Glacier National Park. It was a squat, weather-beaten building, its paint peeled by wind and sun. Locals rarely stopped there anymore. Bigger, newer chains had drawn them away with brighter lights and more options. But truckers still pulled in for coffee and fuel, and road-tripping families sometimes wandered inside for maps or snacks. Fern opened the metal shutter, flipped the sign to open, and went about her routine. She wiped down the counters, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and restocked the shelves with bags of trail mix and jerky. The fluorescent lights flickered once, then settled into a steady glow. She knew every square inch of this place. The way the cooler door stuck if pulled too fast, the hum of the ice machine when it kicked in, the creaky tile near the restroom that always made kids giggle. She greeted the first customers with a polite nod and a faint smile, her eyes tired but kind. Inside, she felt still. Not empty, not sad, just muted, as if her life had slipped into a quiet rhythm that required no changes, no surprises. And for years, it hadn't. Until one particular morning in October when something, or someone, quietly disrupted that silence. Late in the morning, during that quiet lull when the gas station seemed to pause between the early rush and the afternoon trickle of travelers, the bell above the door chimed. Fern looked up from restocking the snack shelf and noticed a boy step inside. He couldn't have been more than 10. His coat hung loosely from narrow shoulders, sleeves too long, the faded fabric swallowing his thin arms. His jeans were clearly borrowed from someone older, cinched awkwardly at the waist with a fraying shoelace. He moved silently, his sneakers making no sound on the stained linoleum floor. Without looking around, he walked straight to the hot drink machine. His small fingers fumbled with a few coins, which he placed neatly on the counter before pressing the button for hot chocolate. The machine hummed and hissed as it filled the paper cup. The boy waited with practiced patience, then wrapped both hands around the warm drink and turned away. He didn't look at Fern. His gaze remained low, cautious, as if avoiding contact was a learned instinct. He walked to the far corner of the seating area, a booth that hadn't seen a customer in weeks, and slid into the seat. From inside his oversized jacket, he pulled out a worn spiral notebook. The cover was bent, the edges curled. He opened it to a middle page and began to draw. Fern watched from behind the counter. At first, she assumed he was with someone. No child wandered into a gas station alone in the middle of a weekday. She expected a parent to follow or perhaps an older sibling. But as the minutes passed, no one came. 10 minutes, then 15. Still he remained, head down, eyes focused, pencil scratching softly against the paper. He didn't touch anything else, didn't ask questions, didn't cause trouble. He sipped his drink slowly, glancing up only when he turned a page in the notebook. When the clock neared noon, he stood, placed the empty cup in the trash, and left without a sound. The next day he returned. Same time, same routine. Coins on the counter, hot chocolate, corner booth, notebook. Fern began to expect the sound of the bell just before 11. She started looking toward the door minutes before he arrived, not out of suspicion, but with a strange sense of anticipation. He never lingered. Always left at the same time, notebook back in his jacket, hands wrapped tight around the cup until it was empty. By the fourth day, Fern noticed something different. After buying his drink and taking his seat, the boy glanced briefly toward the shelf by the register. On it was a small wire basket labeled Samples, holding a few individually wrapped cookies from a local bakery, leftovers given by the delivery driver for customers to try. She pretended not to notice as he walked past on his way out, paused just slightly, and slipped one of the cookies into his pocket with the kind of smooth motion that came from practice, not malice. Fern said nothing. The next morning, when he arrived and settled into his booth, she walked past him on the way to clean a nearby table and gently placed a napkin-wrapped cookie on the edge of his table. He didn't look up. She didn't wait for a reaction. She returned to the counter and continued sorting receipts. The ritual continued. He always brought just enough for the drink. Fern began leaving small items, a muffin, a fruit cup, a granola bar, never more than one, always with the same quiet distance. The boy never asked, never acknowledged it beyond occasionally eating a little faster or placing the wrapper neatly in the trash. In that quiet gas station, among flickering fluorescent lights and dusty shelves, the boy's presence became as routine as the turning of the door sign to open. He remained nameless, quiet, a figure of early morning stillness. And yet, Fern felt the atmosphere shift around him. He was no longer just a customer. He was something else, a question that had yet to be asked, an answer that waited patiently in the form of a boy with careful eyes and an old notebook. A week had passed since the boy first stepped into the gas station, and by then, his quiet routine had become noticeable not only to Fern, but to others who passed through. The first to mention it was Greg, a regular delivery driver who stopped in every Tuesday for black coffee and scratch-off lottery tickets. As he waited for his receipt, he glanced toward the corner booth and squinted. He asked about the boy casually, more out of habit than true curiosity, but the question lingered in the air after he left. The seed had been planted. Over the following days, other customers began to notice. An older couple whispered near the coffee machines, casting sideways glances toward the boy's booth. A teenager filling up his truck outside claimed he'd seen someone matching the boy's description wandering behind the roadside motel near the edge of town. Someone else insisted he'd overheard a deputy at the diner say they were looking for a runaway. Rumors multiplied, vague and shapeless but insistent. Questions turned to concern, and concern turned to thinly veiled judgment. Some thought he was harmless. Others imagined worse. A woman in a beige SUV suggested Fern should call Child Protective Services, just in case. A man in a camouflage jacket muttered that feeding strays only encouraged them to hang around. Fern heard every word. She didn't respond. She folded napkins, wiped down counters, and offered the same tired smile as always. When asked directly, she simply shrugged. People filled in the blanks with whatever made sense to them. She knew that trying to explain would only draw more attention, and she preferred silence over confrontation. But silence didn't last long. 2 days later, she was called into the small, windowless office at the back of the gas station. The manager, a man named Howard, sat behind the cluttered desk, tapping his pen against a clipboard. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words were firm, practiced, a speech he'd likely rehearsed. He told her there had been complaints. People talking, some worried, others angry. The security cameras had recorded her placing food at the boy's table, food that had never been rung up. Muffins, juice boxes, the occasional sandwich. He emphasized the store policy. All items must be accounted for. Nothing could be given away, not without documentation or approval. Exceptions, he warned, created liability. Then came the sentence she had expected. If it happened again, her job would be in jeopardy. Fern didn't argue. She nodded once, stood, and left the office. Howard returned to his paperwork. She returned to the register. The next morning was colder than usual. The mountains beyond the highway were tipped in white. A frost clung to the edges of the gas pump handles. When the boy came in, shivering slightly, his jacket zipped high and his notebook tucked tightly under his arm, Fern prepared his hot chocolate as always. She waited until he had taken his seat, then walked past his table with a cloth in hand. On her way back, she set down a banana muffin, slightly overbaked, she would later tell herself, technically unsellable, easily marked as damaged in the books. She didn't pause to look at him. She didn't need to. The muffin sat there like an unspoken promise, a small rebellion in the face of policy, whispers, and rules. Something in Fern had decided long ago that kindness, however quiet, was never wasted, even if it came with a cost. One morning, the doorbell above the gas station remained silent at the time it usually rang. Fern glanced toward the entrance, waiting out of habit, but the boy didn't appear. She dismissed it at first. Maybe he was late. Maybe he had caught a ride somewhere. But the booth in the corner remained empty, the steam from the hot chocolate machine drifting into air that no longer carried the quiet hum of his presence. The next day, he was still gone, and the day after that. Outside, the weather shifted. Autumn, once crisp and golden, began to darken at the edges. Clouds hung low over the hills, and the wind moved differently, heavier, carrying the smell of snow. A light dusting came early, the kind that didn't stick but whispered of deeper cold to come. Fern began watching the road more often. Her eyes flicked up each time the door creaked open, but it was always someone else. A trucker, a tired couple, never him. She found herself staying longer after her shifts, wiping already clean surfaces, checking the front step, peeking through the blinds toward the woods across the highway. The booth remained untouched. Each day, she set a cup of hot chocolate there anyway, and once she placed a granola bar next to it just in case. The absence settled into her routine like a bruise. She didn't know his name. She didn't know where he came from or where he went after he left her door. But she remembered how he gripped his pencil, the way his hand hovered before committing to the page, the expressions he sketched from memory or imagination. He drew people he had never met, perhaps never would. Days stretched into a week. Snow began to fall more steadily, swirling through the early evenings and icing the windows of the station. Fern wrapped herself tighter in her coat on the walk to her truck, her boots crunching softly through thin layers of white. It was on the 7th evening, dark already, the wind sharpening, that she noticed something tucked against her front door, a folded sheet of paper weighted by a small stone. She bent down slowly, fingers stiff from cold, and picked it up. The drawing had been done in pencil and smudged by a thumb that had lingered too long. It was unmistakable. The sketch showed the gas station, every angle familiar, down to the crack in the sidewalk and the wonky E on the neon sign. Behind the counter stood a woman with tired eyes and a soft smile. The details were simple but clear. She recognized her own face, lined and kind. Below the image, in small block letters, was a single word: "Thank you." Fern stood in the doorway, the cold biting at her cheeks, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. The neighborhood was still. Snow fell in lazy spirals through the yellow halo of the streetlight. She pressed the drawing to her chest and leaned her forehead against the doorframe. In the quiet that followed, a sound rose up from her. Not loud, not dramatic, but raw, a short, broken gasp that escaped before she could swallow it. The first true sound of emotion her house had heard in months. She stepped inside, closed the door gently behind her, and pinned the drawing to the refrigerator with a rusted magnet. Then she sat at the kitchen table, wrapped in a blanket, staring at it. The boy was still gone, but now he had left something behind, something more than silence. Something that mattered. 3 days after the drawing appeared at her door, the quiet rhythm of Butte was broken by a sound that didn't belong. A deep mechanical hum grew louder by the minute, echoing across the hills and bouncing off buildings like a slow-moving storm. Residents emerged from diners and hardware stores, shading their eyes with gloved hands as a sleek black helicopter descended from the sky. It hovered for a moment over the frost-hardened field across from the gas station, sending snow and dry grass into a swirling cyclone. Then it landed gently, blades slowing but still roaring in the cold morning air. Not long after, two matte black SUVs rolled up the side road, pulling into formation like part of a rehearsed maneuver. Dust and snow mingled in the air, cloaking the strange arrival in cinematic haze. Fern stood behind the counter, coffee pot in hand, staring through the streaked window. She had seen helicopters before, of course. Life flights, military drills, but never here, and never for someone like her. She placed the pot back on its warmer and wiped her hands on her apron, heart ticking faster than it had in weeks. From the helicopter stepped three figures, two in long coats, the third in a charcoal suit, his silver-streaked hair combed neatly back. He moved with practiced calm, not rushing, not hesitating. His face was unreadable, but his presence carried weight. He was joined by the two others from the SUVs, one carrying a slim leather case, the other holding a narrow portfolio tucked under his arm. They crossed the road slowly, as if unbothered by the biting wind or the crowd that had begun to gather near the diner and auto shop. When the suited man entered the gas station, the bell above the door jingled lightly, a sound far too soft for the moment. He looked around, took in the room, then walked to the counter. He asked for Fern by name. When she confirmed who she was, he nodded once and introduced himself as Jack Walsh. The name meant nothing to her, not right away. But the look in his eyes did. A combination of weariness and relief, the expression of someone who had been searching. He opened the folder he carried, placed it gently on the counter, and laid out several documents. Crisp paper, neat signatures, gold-lettered headers. One was a notarized letter of thanks. Another was a legal statement regarding a personal donation, funds earmarked for health care, home repair, and the launch of a community space, a bookstore cafe, if she so wished. He explained that the boy she had quietly fed and watched over for weeks was his son. A year ago, Jack's wife had died in a car accident. The loss had shattered their small family. Struggling with grief and mental strain, Jack had withdrawn, retreating into work, leaving his son in the temporary care of the state. The boy had run away shortly after, slipping between cities and highways until he found his way to Butte, until he found Fern. She had been the only person, Jack said, who had shown his son kindness without conditions. No interrogation, no suspicion, just small comforts offered freely. Jack's voice broke slightly when he said that it was his son who insisted they come here in person, that she deserved more than a letter. From the portfolio, the assistant withdrew a folded sheet. It was a new drawing, rendered in the same pencil lines and shaded with more care than before. The image showed Fern standing beside the boy at the gas station window. Outside, the snow fell softly, but inside, the light glowed warm. There was a small table beside them with 2 cups, steam curling upward in matching spirals. On the windowsill sat a tiny, open book. Jack said that the boy called the station his safe place, a place where nobody asked who he was, and nobody made him feel small. Fern took the drawing carefully, fingertips lingering on the paper as if absorbing the memory it held. The men didn't stay long. Jack shook her hand before leaving, thanked her again, not just from himself, but from a father trying to reclaim something he thought was lost. The helicopters lifted again minutes later, stirring the snow into white clouds, then disappeared beyond the ridgeline. The town talked for days, but Fern said little. She pinned the drawing beside the first one on her refrigerator. Later that night, as she sat at her kitchen table, the lights dim and the house quiet as ever, she realized something had changed. Not just in the air, but in the way her own story now felt fuller. And somewhere between the lines of pencil on paper, between the snow and the silence, she knew that something good had taken root. Something that didn't need words to matter. 1 year later, the old gas station was no more. Where pumps had once stood rusting beneath flickering lights, now stood wide windows that welcomed the morning sun. The faded signage had been replaced with a hand-painted name in deep, calming blue, Window by the Highway. The building had been transformed, not flashy, not grand, but quiet and warm. A place that seemed to breathe slowly, as if at peace with its purpose. Inside, soft yellow lights cast a gentle glow across wooden tables arranged near the windows. The scent of cinnamon and roasted coffee beans lingered in the air, mingling with the soft rustle of pages turning and spoons stirring. Along one wall stretched shelves filled with second-hand books, carefully sorted by genre, but not fussed over. Some were stacked horizontally, others leaned like old friends against one another. Near the back, a corner nook held a worn armchair and a hand-knitted blanket draped lazily across its arm. In the far right of the cafe stood a narrow display, a simple stand made from reclaimed wood. On it were pinned a series of pencil drawings, each one delicate in its lines but rich in feeling. Under each sketch, a small white label read, "For the chocolate, for the muffin, for the silence." They were dated, spaced apart like quiet chapters in a story that only a few people knew. The boy had sent more over time, never with a note, never with explanation. But they arrived, always folded neatly, always signed with a single initial. Fern stood behind the counter, her hands steady as she adjusted the settings on the new espresso machine. The blue apron she wore was the same one she had used at the gas station, its fabric softened with age and memory. Her hair was pulled back, and a pair of reading glasses rested on the bridge of her nose. She looked older, but something in her posture had shifted. The subtle weight she once carried had lightened, replaced by something calmer, steadier, a quiet knowing. Customers came and went throughout the day. Teenagers from the local high school stopped by after class for cocoa and banana bread. Truckers on the long haul northward pulled in for rest and warmth. Some visitors said nothing at all, just sipped their drinks slowly while watching snow drift past the window panes. Others stayed for hours, hunched over journals or quietly speaking with Fern as she swept or restocked the cookie jars. Above the door, just below the small brass bell, hung a wooden sign carved by hand. Its lettering was simple, carefully etched and darkened by time. "Warmth is free. Chocolate if you want it. If you're lost, come in." People often paused to read it before entering. Some smiled, others lingered just a moment longer than they needed to. And when they stepped inside, the door always closed gently behind them, as if the cafe itself was careful not to break the stillness within. Fern never explained the sign to anyone. She didn't have to. Those who needed it understood, and those who didn't, well, they were welcome all the same. Sometimes, late in the evening, after the last cup had been served and the tables wiped clean, Fern would sit near the drawings and trace the pencil lines with her eyes. The figures were always simple, but they carried something true. Two people beside a window, a cup on the table, a square of light on the floor. She kept a notebook beneath the counter now, filled with sketches of her own. She didn't draw well, not like him, but she tried. Faces, trees, small moments. Most were unfinished. That didn't bother her. Outside, headlights passed on the highway, stretching north and south, going somewhere. But for those who happened to stop, for whatever reason, hunger, exhaustion, or something harder to name, there was always a chair waiting, a drink on the house, and a woman who knew what it meant to be seen. Because once on an ordinary day she had looked across a counter and recognized that someone didn't need questions, only kindness. And from that small recognition, something lasting had grown, something quiet and good.